Imagine a place where the wind doesn't just blow, it screams. A landscape carved by volcanic fury and glacial ice, where snow drives sideways, scouring everything in its path. For months, daylight is a distant memory, replaced by an endless twilight gloom. Temperatures plunge far below freezing, and monstrous storms rage across the Northern Ocean, winds strong enough to rip the clothes from your back, to knock a grown man off his feet. This was the reality for the ancient voyagers who, 1,000 years ago, dared to cross vast, unforgiving seas and settle these remote northern lands. They were a people of remarkable courage, driven by a spirit of exploration and a desperate hope for new beginnings. But when they finally stepped ashore, after weeks battling the relentless waves, they faced an immediate, terrifying question. How do you build a home, a shelter sturdy enough to survive this brutal environment, when there isn't a single mature tree in sight? This wasn't just an architectural puzzle, it was an existential crisis. These intrepid settlers hailed from forested regions, lands rich with timber. They were master carpenters, accustomed to felling mighty oaks and pines, shaping logs into sturdy beams, and raising grand, towering halls with vertical wooden walls and steep shingled roofs. Their entire building tradition, their very concept of shelter, was rooted in wood. But here, on these desolate coasts, stretching as far as the eye could see, there was nothing but rock, thin soil, and low, scrubby bushes clinging desperately to the hillsides. The towering forests of their homeland were gone. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Winter in these latitudes shows no mercy. A poorly constructed dwelling meant certain death, frostbite, hypothermia, starvation. Fuel was scarce, the ground froze solid, and the precious few hours of daylight offered little reprieve. Every instinct would have screamed to find wood, to somehow replicate the homes they knew. But there was no wood. There was only the raw, untamed earth. And that's when their true genius emerged. Instead of fighting the environment, they embraced it. They stopped looking for what they didn't have and started seeing the incredible potential in what lay beneath their feet. Their revolutionary solution was astonishingly simple, yet profoundly effective. They would build with the earth itself. They transformed the very ground into their walls and crowned their roofs with living grass. They didn't just build on the landscape, they built into it, creating structures so seamlessly integrated that from a distance they appeared as nothing more than gentle grassy mounds, perhaps with a door peeking out. These were the legendary turf houses, long, low dwellings whose thick earthen walls became an impenetrable fortress against the elements. At the heart of this innovation lay a humble yet powerful material, peat. Beneath the thin blanket of grass covering the landscape lay vast deposits of this partially decomposed plant matter. It was dense, compact, and could be easily cut into rectangular blocks, much like bricks. These peat blocks were light enough for people to carry, yet heavy enough to form incredibly stable, solid walls. But their most critical property was insulation. Unlike wood, which eventually succumbs to the cold, the intricate cellular structure of peat trapped countless pockets of air, creating an unparalleled natural barrier against the frigid temperatures. A wall of peat, a meter thick, could hold warmth inside far more effectively than any wooden wall, no matter its dimension. It was an insulator nature had perfected over millennia, and these ancient builders learned to harness its power. But turf alone, remarkable as it was, couldn't support a roof or frame a doorway. For that, the settlers still needed wood, the most precious and coveted resource in their new world. Every single piece was revered, rationed, and recycled. Waste was not an option. So they turned their gaze to the horizon, to the vast, turbulent ocean that had brought them to these shores. And in a stroke of incredible luck, the ocean, in its own mysterious way, provided. Across the Arctic Circle, mighty rivers in distant lands, hundreds, even thousands of miles away, carried torrents of meltwater north, sweeping countless logs from ancient forests into the polar sea. These logs, trapped in the glacial embrace of sea ice, began an epic multi-year journey. Carried by the slow, powerful currents that circled the top of the world, they drifted westward, eventually breaking free off these very northern coasts. This was a godsend. Driftwood washed up on the beaches, sometimes in great abundance, sometimes barely a trickle. But whenever it arrived, it was treated like pure treasure. Coastal inhabitants had legal claim to any timber that appeared on their property. Men would laboriously haul the logs inland, carefully dry them, and meticulously split them. A single good beam could frame a crucial doorway. A handful of posts could provide the essential skeleton for a roof. This precious wood didn't need to bear the immense weight of the walls. The turf did that. It only needed to provide structural integrity, a minimal frame to hold the house's shape. These ingenious people understood that conservation was key. Every scrap of wood was salvaged, reused, and passed down through generations, a testament to their profound respect for resources in a truly treeless world. The construction of these turf houses was a systematic, labor-intensive process, a testament to collective effort and ingenious design. First, a suitable site was chosen, often on a gentle slope to ensure proper drainage. The ground was meticulously leveled, and a robust foundation of flat stones was laid. These stones served a dual purpose. They prevented the turf walls from resting directly on damp soil, which would cause rot, and they provided an incredibly stable base for the immense weight of the earthen structure above. Once the foundation was secure, the minimal timber frame was erected. Vertical posts were either sunk into the ground or set firmly on stone pads. Crossbeams connected these posts, and a strong ridgepole ran the entire length of the building, forming the spine of the roof. This wooden skeleton was deliberately sparse, just enough to give the structure its essential form. Then the true work began, the turf laying. Builders meticulously stacked rectangular sod blocks, each typically the size of a large loaf of bread, around the timber frame. They were laid in a herringbone pattern, angled inward at roughly 45 degrees. This clever technique ensured that the weight of each subsequent layer pressed inward rather than outward, creating walls of astonishing strength and preventing collapse. The walls rose slowly, course by course, growing thicker at the base, often reaching 2 meters in depth, tapering slightly as they ascended. Finally, the roof. Rafters of driftwood were carefully laid across the ridgepole, and over these more layers of turf were meticulously applied until the entire structure was enveloped. From above, the finished house looked like nothing more than an elongated green mound, a seamless part of the natural landscape, with a single door as its only interruption. In winter, snow would pile upon the roof, adding yet another layer of perfect insulation. In warmer months, the grass would continue to grow, roots intertwining, further binding the structure. The house breathed, it settled, it became an organic extension of the earth itself. Most of these remarkable dwellings followed a rectangular plan, aptly named longhouses, their lengths often stretching from 12 to over 20 meters. The heart of every home was the main hall, known as the scaly. This communal space was where the family lived, ate, worked, and slept, a bustling hub of activity and warmth. At the very center of the scaly was the hearth, not a modern fireplace, but a shallow pit dug into the floor, lined with stones and filled with slow-burning peat or precious driftwood. Crucially, there was no chimney. Smoke ascended towards the roof, eventually finding its escape through a small opening, a vent known as a luri in their ancient tongue.
This opening was meticulously sized, just large enough to allow smoke to escape, yet small enough to retain precious heat. On calm, windless days, smoke would hang heavy in the hall, stinging eyes, and gradually blackening the turf walls and timber beams, a constant reminder of the fire that sustained them. Tending the fire was a perpetual, vital task. Someone always had to feed the fuel, adjust the smoke hole, and keep the coals alive through the long, dark nights. But that flickering, vital fire, though modest, made life possible. The physics of the turf house were ingenious. Heat from the hearth radiated outwards. In a conventional timber building, much of that heat would simply escape. But in a turf house, the incredibly thick earthen walls absorbed the heat, acting like a giant thermal battery. Peat has a high thermal mass. It takes time to warm up, but once heated, it releases that warmth slowly and steadily. The walls themselves became warm to the touch. The air inside, trapped by the low ceiling and minimal openings, remained warm even when the fire dwindled. Body heat from the inhabitants, the steam from cooking, the ambient warmth of daily life, all contributed to a self-sustaining microclimate within that earthen shell.
Outside, temperatures might plummet to 20 degrees below freezing, with winds howling at 40 miles per hour. But inside, nestled beneath 2 meters of turf, the air could be warm enough to sit in shirt sleeves. Records from ancient sites suggest that interior temperatures in these well-maintained homes could be tens of degrees warmer than the brutal air outside. The house was a living shield, buffering its occupants from the wild extremes of the northern climate. The layout further reinforced this efficiency. Low benches, crafted from wood or stone, lined the hall, serving as seats by day and communal beds by night. Family members slept huddled together, often with animal hides for warmth. Everyone clustered around the fire, not just tradition, but an imperative for survival. Spreading out meant wasting heat. The very architecture enforced a communal existence, physically arranging people in the most thermally efficient configuration possible. In some dwellings, additional rooms were integrated. A byre for cattle or sheep, often adjoining the main hall, separated by a simple partition but sharing the same roof. The body heat of the animals, like that of the humans, contributed to the overall warmth. These ancient builders didn't heat their barns, they allowed their barns to heat their homes. This deep integration with the land wasn't merely practical, it fostered a unique social dynamic. In most medieval societies, architecture screamed status. Kings resided in stone castles, nobles in grand timber manors. But in these remote northern communities, that hierarchy dissolved. Everyone, from chieftain to farmer, lived in turf. The environment was the great equalizer. You couldn't build a stone castle without quarries, nor a grand timber hall without forests. So even the wealthiest families lived beneath sod roofs. Status, when it was displayed, manifested inside, perhaps finely carved imported wooden panels, or even a small timber structure built within the larger turf shell, a house within a house, offering prestige and extra warmth. But from the outside, the chieftain's home looked much like the poorest farmer's, a humble grassy mound with a door. This architectural uniformity was highly unusual for the era, a stark reflection of nature's indifference to human rank. Cold did not discriminate. Survival depended on the same fundamental strategies for everyone. Yet the hall was far more than simple shelter. It was the absolute core of family identity, the place where lineage was recounted, honor maintained, and stories woven into the fabric of time. Sagas, written centuries later, still speak of the halls of famous figures, not as grand palaces, but as places of immense meaning. The hearth was where oaths were sworn, disputes settled, and epic tales were cited through the long, dark winters. The fire was witness to everything. Religious life also revolved around the hearth. Before the arrival of a new faith, families practiced ancient customs, making offerings to spirits and gods near the family altar, often positioned by the hearth. The fire itself held profound symbolic weight. It was life, warmth, light. To allow it to die out was to invite disaster. Even after conversion to a new religion, much of this symbolism transferred. Small turf chapels were built using the same methods, low and sod-roofed, often indistinguishable from secular buildings, save for a simple cross. Inside, a small hearth still provided warmth during services. The architecture remained, only the rituals changed. These living homes, however, demanded constant attention. Turf slowly rots, grass eventually dies, and rain inexorably erodes. Every few years, the outer layers of turf had to be replaced, new blocks cut and stacked over the old. Roofs especially required meticulous care. Pooling water could seep through, drenching the interior, so roofs were regularly re-turfed, grass trimmed, and drainage channels cleared. The house was a living entity, demanding stewardship. Neglect, and it would simply collapse back into the hillside. This continuous renewal meant that individual turf houses rarely stood unchanged for more than a generation or two without significant repair. Yet the blueprint endured. When an old house fell into disrepair, a new one was often built on the same foundation, using the same stone base and floor plan. Over centuries, layers of occupation accumulated. Archaeologists excavating these ancient sites frequently uncover multiple phases of construction, old walls buried beneath new ones, hearths rebuilt atop older hearths, floors gradually rising as debris and ash piled up. Each house became a palimpsest, each generation writing its story over the last. The eventual decline of turf houses was slow, paralleling the gradual integration of these remote lands into broader trade networks. Imported timber slowly became more accessible. By later centuries, some wealthier families began constructing hybrid structures, stone foundations, timber frames, but still clad in turf for its unbeatable insulation. In some regions, ancient settlements eventually failed entirely, abandoned as climate conditions worsened and supply lines from distant lands frayed. Their turf houses stood empty, slowly succumbing to the elements, melting back into the earth from which they came.
Yet, in other areas, turf construction persisted for far longer. Well into recent centuries, rural farms continued to build with sod. The method simply worked. It was economical, remarkably effective, and perfectly suited to the landscape. Only with the advent of truly modern materials, concrete, steel, industrially produced lumber, did turf finally fall out of widespread use. Today, a precious few preserved turf houses remain, carefully maintained as living museums. They stand as poignant reminders of a time when these early settlers quite literally built their homes from the ground up, out of necessity, ingenuity, and a profound understanding of their world. Modern architects and sustainable designers have, in recent times, rediscovered many of the timeless principles behind turf houses. Earth-sheltered buildings, green roofs, passive solar design. All borrow from the same fundamental logic that guided those ancient builders 1,000 years ago. Soil insulates. Thermal mass stabilizes temperature. Minimizing exposed surface area reduces heat loss. These are not new ideas. They are ancient wisdom, painstakingly refined by necessity in some of the harshest climates on Earth. The turf house stands as an enduring testament to the boundless adaptability of the human spirit. Faced with an environment that offered almost nothing recognizable as building material, no timber, no stone suitable for large structures, no surplus of anything, these settlers made do. They transformed grass into walls. They harnessed the immense power of ocean currents to deliver timber from forests they would never see. They dug into the frozen ground and coaxed it into becoming a shelter for themselves and their families. And in doing so, they not only survived, they thrived. They raised families, forged communities, composed epic sagas, and explored new horizons.
Their ingenuity wasn't found in grand, never-before-seen innovations. It was in the meticulous attention to detail, in an intuitive understanding of how heat moves, how water drains, how wind scourges, how fire warms. It was in the laborious stacking of 10,000 turf blocks to form a wall, in the careful splitting of a single log to make 2 beams, in the endless tending of a hearth that could not be allowed to die. The turf house was a machine for living, designed not by engineers in laboratories, but by farmers, fishermen, and families who had no other choice but to get it right. Centuries have passed since the last family huddled around a peat fire in a sod-roofed hall, but the lesson endures. Survival isn't about conquering the environment. It's about profound understanding, about working with it, and about transforming its raw, humble materials into brilliant solutions. These ancient voyagers didn't have the luxury of importing what they needed. They had to use what was already there: soil, grass, driftwood, stone. And from those seemingly meager resources, they built homes that lasted for generations, sheltering entire families through winters that would have been fatal to anyone less resourceful. In the end, the turf house was more than architecture. It was a philosophy made manifest. It declared that no environment is too harsh, no resource too scarce, if you are willing to think differently. It proclaimed that the very ground beneath your feet, the grass you walk on, the soil you stand upon, these can be transformed into shelter, into warmth, into safety. It is a quiet reminder, carved into 1,000 grassy hillsides across the northern reaches of the world, that true human ingenuity doesn't always appear as soaring towers or gleaming steel. Sometimes it takes the form of a humble mound of earth with a door, unassuming, quiet, yet profoundly, wonderfully warm inside when the world outside is frozen solid.